when the editorial team asked me to talk a bit about the history of motorcycles, I thought to myself, nothing could be easier. But the more I started to think about this topic, the more I realized that it's not going to be that simple at all. I'm going to talk about the history of motorcycles. However, I suspect that this will actually be more of a general history of motorization, and probably in a way you wouldn't expect, because from the very first vehicles, it's basically impossible to separate cars from motorcycles, because if we count tricycles as motorcycles rather than cars, then essentially it all started almost with tricycles, not to mention the very first vehicle. Benz's, which actually wasn't the first running motorcycle, as everyone has thought up until now, but I'll talk more about that next time. The second problem arose naturally almost immediately. Namely, I started to wonder which came first, the chicken or the egg? In our case, the engine or the frame. These aren't really things that well. Right now they're connected, but back then it was completely different. And as I started to look into the issue, it turns out that engines are hundreds, if not thousands of years older than motorcycle frames and the construction of, well, two-wheelers. The first thing that came to my mind from physics class, which everyone probably covered in elementary school about engines, was the steam turbine. Hero of Alexandria's, he invented it somewhere around the 50s AD. But when I later dug into further historical discoveries, it turns out that people were able to use electric current as early as about 500 years earlier. The only thing is, they didn't know it was electricity or that they were using it. But let's say the first thing that was really constructed in a, how should I put it, conscious and deliberate way, something that in my opinion could be considered an engine, was the steam turbine. It consisted of a small boiler with a fire burning underneath. There was water in the boiler. The water would turn into steam. Through two small pipes, the steam would rise up to a sphere, to which two nozzle-like attachments were connected. These were pipes positioned opposite each other at a right angle in 90 degrees, pointing in opposite directions. When the water boiled, the steam would travel to the sphere, and from this sphere it would escape through those pipes, causing the sphere to start spinning. If something spins, I guess you could already call it an engine. But can you guess what the first use of this steam turbine, Heron's turbine, was? None. It was simply a little toy meant to amuse people, probably nothing more than that. But the next inventions, which could in some way be considered engines, let's say, things that were actually more useful and functional, those were engines. And actually, coming back to Heron's steam turbine, I'm not really sure whether it should be called a steam engine or a turbine, because it ran on steam, but it was still a turbine. Let me tell you this, I saw an engine powered by a turbine once in my life, but of course not a steam turbine, rather a turbine from a jet aircraft. And it was a motorcycle during the 100th anniversary of the races on the Isle of Man, where I went with some friends, not only to watch but also to take part in a rally there. I saw a guy riding astride such a turbine engine on Main Street in the capital of the Isle of Man, and it was simply an amazing sight. And this only came to mind because it might seem that these engines could be steam, electric or combustion engines, but it turns out that turbine engines also appear in motorcycles, and perhaps in later stories we'll get to turbine engines, which basically maybe serve only to break speed records for such vehicles, where combustion engines, let's say, well, had already reached the limits of their capabilities in terms of power and so on. So let's move on to the history of steam engines. That's not such a simple matter either, because the first engines, well, all right, maybe we shouldn't even call them engines, but rather a machine that had a piston inside and basically used that piston to push something, and that piston would pull something along. It was a remarkable machine, meticulously constructed in the year 1682. My apologies if I happen to mispronounce the name. The gunpowder machine of Huygens. He was an inventor, basically a bit of a mechanic and so on, who was conducting research precisely on the usefulness of this type of machine for practical operation. It was an atmospheric machine operating on the principle that there was a piston, a cylinder, and inside the cylinder gunpowder was burned. And don't think that because of this the piston, so to speak, pushed the connecting rod and it started to rotate. No, it worked on the principle that the gunpowder burned up the oxygen contained in the cylinder. Then a vacuum was created, and this vacuum, so to speak, pulled on a string which was used to power the fountain in the royal gardens in France. And basically this device could be cold well. I'm not entirely sure myself, because it's definitely not a steam engine, but it is certainly a piston-driven machine. However, at that time people had already started to think about using atmospheric phenomena, and generally about the movement of a piston inside a cylinder. What could be done with this next? Then the consequences of this event were, I would say, already quite straightforward, because humanity came up with the idea to replace the vacuum, so to speak, with overpressure, and for that steam was used. But I'll talk about that in the next episode of my talk, because as you can see, we've only just started on the topic of steam engines.